Flushing turns into a total zoo when the Yanks, Giants, Jets, and Mets all share Shea Stadium. The first time 4 pro sports teams had ever done it.
This is one of those interesting scenarios here where you have Shea Stadium, and we all remember Shea Stadium kind of being a dump those last few years. But for a while, Shea Stadium was not just the center of New York City sports, but you can make the argument sports in this country. You have 4 teams playing here, first time ever in U.S. sports history where you have 4 teams sharing the same stadium, and none of them are really that good, to be honest with you. The Mets were 82-70. The Yankees were kind of on the upswing at this point, but they only had 83 wins. They didn't make the playoffs. The Giants were unforgettable. The Jets weren't that good.
I think the interesting thing that you want to remember about this deal at Shea is that the Jets and the Mets called Shea Stadium home. The Yankees and the Giants never belonged there. They were out of place to begin with, and all it did was enhance the sour taste in their fans' mouths because their teams weren't that good anyway. And on top of that, they're playing where the Jets and the Mets played.
The Mets, the Yankees that year, the Giants and the Jets, they waved one flag, the white flag, because they were all so horrible. They basically rolled over and folded for all of their adversaries that came into Shea Stadium. Maybe the worst decision ever made to put all 4 teams in that stadium because it was miserable. I didn't care which fan you were. It was just a miserable year.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hey gang, how is it going? My name is Tim Hanlon, and you're back again. Thanks so much for coming back to our little podcast. We call it Good Seats Still Available, our curious little journey each and every week into what used to be in professional sports. And we're going to sort of veer back into the genre of arenas and stadia in our little journey this week with our guest Brent Topel, and we're going to be talking about an interesting little anecdote, a little asterisk, if you will, in the history of New York City metropolitan area sports, and we take you back to the summer and then later the fall of 1975. And the place, as you heard hinted at in our little intro there from the documentary that aired on Sports New York, SNY, a couple of years back, we're going to be talking about Shea Stadium in 1975, a place and a time when not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 professional sports franchises inhabited that one building. It was an interesting confluence of time and events. And yes, the Mets and the Jets, obviously the major tenants of Shea Stadium, were joined by their crosstown rivals, the Yankees and the Giants, during the course of 1975 in a perfect storm of situation that brought all of those teams together playing in one place, that being Shea Stadium. Not necessarily the most modern or well-regarded, architecturally marvelous stadiums ever built. But in 1975, and an interesting time in New York City history as well, not necessarily for the best of reasons, the only game in town, literally, for all 4 of these professional franchises was to play at Shea. And we're going to get into that with Brett. He's written a book, a very interesting little story about this little forgotten time in New York City sports history, and in a building that is certainly loved, but not necessarily always revered by people who inhabited it. That being Shea Stadium. The book is called When Shea Was Home: The Story of the 1975 Mets, Yankees, Giants, and Jets. And if you're wondering at home if this qualifies as fitting our little genre, well, yeah, sure. Shea Stadium doesn't exist anymore. And that, as far as I'm concerned, fits our little forgotten sports genre. So there, I think you're going to enjoy this conversation. I learned a bunch of tidbits. I grew up in the New York metropolitan area. I fancy myself as a football and baseball fan of the Mets, not as much the Jets, but certainly very aware of them and their stories and their headlines during my childhood. But I will tell you, there are a bunch of things that I learned in this conversation. I thought I knew everything about New York sports, especially from my childhood. And I encourage you to listen to our conversation with Brett Topel coming up about the Shea Stadium, a Circa 75. Interesting stuff coming your way momentarily. We want to remind you, of course, that one of the best ways, aside from rating and reviewing us wherever you find this show, and it doesn't really matter where, certainly Apple Podcasts / iTunes, not a bad place, but any of the places where you're able to give us some stars and some love, some commentary, that's always a good way and an inexpensive way, a cheap and free way to show some love for the show. But if you want to go that one extra mile and help us keep our lights on and all these great stories coming to you each and every week, why don't you partake of one of our great sponsors who've got great stuff, and it's all relevant to this great little genre that we're digging into each and every week here on Good Seats Still Available. One, of course, is sportshistorycollectibles.com. And that's the place for all kinds of great memorabilia. I suspect you will find memorabilia from the 1975 Mets or Yankees or Jets, or, as we'll talk about, the New York Football Giants. If you remember, 1975 was the year of the sort of forgotten logo of the sort of disco era, NY logo on their helmets, and it came and went. It was never to be repeated again, and it only occurred during the 1975 season of the New York Football Giants. I'm not sure, but it's worth a look at sportshistorycollectibles.com to see if any of those things, memorabilia from that year of the Giants, and for that matter, the Mets, the Yankees, or the Jets of that year, or any year for that matter, are all there for you probably to find. And if it's not there this week, well, wait till next week or the week after. You never know what you might find at sportshistorycollectibles.com. Always new stuff being uploaded there. And make sure you use the promo code GOODSEATS for 15% off all your purchases when you go and take part in the wares there at sportshistorycollectibles.com. Not to be outdone, of course, is oldschoolshirts.com, he says. Not so easily. Oldschoolshirts.com, great distressed logo wear from teams and leagues no longer with us or previously incarnated, but also other things in pop culture, whether they be old malls, shopping malls of yore, or perhaps some radio stations and some iconic call letters. Those are there as well. There's all a bunch of cool stuff. New prints and new designs coming up there just about almost every other week. And at oldschoolshirts.com, you can use a promo code there and use that promo code GOODSEATS at that site, and you're going to get 10% off all of your purchases at oldschoolshirts.com. Lots of great stuff, especially in the realm of sports. You're going to love their stuff. And P.F. Wilson and friends in Cincinnati are really good at what they do. Give them a look, give them a click, and give them a purchase, will you? And use that promo code GOODSEATS at oldschoolshirts.com. All right, last and certainly not least, our friends at 503 Sports out in Portland, Oregon, the beautiful Pacific Northwest. 503 Sports, you can find them at 503-sports.com or 503-sports.com. Your choice, all the same thing. They fancy themselves, and we obviously underline and agree with that, as the king of throwbacks. And as you're going to see in the weeks and months to come, beyond sort of the logo wear T-shirt stuff, which they do quite well as well, they also are very, very into the idea of creating or recreating some of the great jerseys and uniforms of the teams and leagues that no longer exist anymore. And in particular, if you're a fan of some of the long-forgotten or oft-forgotten football leagues, like the USFL, perhaps the XFL, or the vaunted World League of American Football, the precursor to NFL Europe, if you remember that from the 1990s or so. Hell, even the XFL, the original version, obviously coming back next year. But you will be amazed, surprised, and delighted to know that a number of those teams, the World Football League too, for that matter, for God's sakes, have been remembered lovingly. Not all the teams, but I'm sure you could request some, and they would certainly give that a pursuit to create some new ones. But they've got a whole bunch of team uniforms that they have crafted and created from the photography of the past, and they've done it lovingly so. Small batches. They are hard to find. They are hard to get, and there's only a limited quantity. And all those at 503 Sports. Give those a look. I think you're going to find at least one of those that's going to be really cool for your wardrobe, and you're going to amaze and impress your friends, especially given the limited quantities. They are rare and going to be rare indeed. Make sure when you're there at 503 or 503-sports.com that you also use that promo code SEATS, SEATS, and you're going to get 10% off all of your purchases there. That's 503 Sports. Find them at 503-sports.com, 503-sports.com, your choice. Thank you so much to them, to all of our sponsors, and to you for considering them and hopefully making a couple of purchases once in a while to help us keep our little show going. And we appreciate it to no end. And we appreciate you listening to no end. Well, at least to the end of this show. Why not? Our interview coming up right now with Brett Topel, and our discussion about the 1975 seasons, plural, of the 4 teams that inhabited Shea Stadium. Here is our chat just from a couple of weeks ago. This is a fascinating little adventure for me, not only this particular topic. I grew up in the New York metropolitan area myself, northern New Jersey, in fact. Had enough of an exposure to Shea Stadium over that time. It was not immediately close. I mean, New Jersey, right? Yankee Stadium and Shea were these sort of, journeys that one had to take. But my first football game ever was a New York Jets game against the New England Patriots back in the day. And my first baseball game was a Yankee game, but my second one, and the second 2 or 3 games were Met games. So some very interesting and memorable events in my sort of Shea Stadium background. But let's get into, before we get into the story, which I think is really interesting and kind of a really good example of some of the kinds of things we'd like to isolate and sort of delve into on this little show. Give us a little bit of background about you and how this story or this slice of Shea Stadium's history came onto your radar and enough to, compel you to commit it to writing.
Sure. Well, it was an idea that I first came up with in about 2012, going a few years back. And I came across the story and found it fascinating because, I mean, these days there's not even 2 teams sharing a stadium, let alone 3 or 4. It seemed like such a bizarre story. And I figured that people who were young enough didn't know that it had ever happened, and people that were older might have forgotten that it had happened. So I started doing some research, realized there was very little written on it, and it was something that I had always wanted to write something about Shea Stadium. To your point, it's the stadium that I grew up going to with my dad and my mom and my grandparents, and I always wanted to write something about Shea, and this, that combined with this story, became what it ended up happening for me.
So a lot of this story, we're kind of circling around the year 1975 in Shea Stadium's history for those outside the New York metropolitan area or who were just, living under a rock at that time. Last night, literally, we have not dropped the episode yet. We will soon. We had a very good conversation about the AFL version of the Jets with a guy named Bob Lederer, who's got a new book out called Beyond Broadway Joe, where he kind of delves into the team of that year and a little bit of before and how it got that way, but not from sort of the lens of like Joe Namath being all things and that, but a recognition that there was a whole team, and support staff around him that were arguably neglected and not sort of given as much much in the way of props as that magical season of 68 into 69, culminated in the Super Bowl win in that year. But one of the things that sort of came out of that, which I was unaware of, right, was this, and I guess this dates back to the beginning days of this stadium, right? And we've talked about the Continental League and then that begetting the New York Mets and getting them a franchise in 62 and the building of Shea. It's my understanding, and maybe this is a good place to start, is that, the Mets kind of held sway for whatever reason, whether it was contractually or otherwise, around scheduling, right? Where the Jets were, for most of the years in that stadium, pretty much the second-class citizens, so to speak, having to revolve around the Mets' schedule first. And I'm wondering if that's an interesting place to start, maybe some of the seeds of like how this all came to be in 75, in particular, the two teams that already existed in that stadium, the Mets and the Jets.
Well, I think you're right. And I think it was an interesting dynamic because, the stadium was built, it was going to be built by Robert Moses originally for the Brooklyn Dodgers. He was trying to get Walter O'Malley to do anything to not go out west. And he wanted the Dodgers to play at what became Shea Stadium. And, of course, as we know, O'Malley said, if I'm going to play in Queens, I might as well go to Los Angeles, something along those lines. So, he wasn't having it. So when the Mets, as you mentioned, the whole Continental League thing happened, and then Bill Shea got the team to stay and be a part of the National League in '62. When they built Shea Stadium in '64, it was really the Mets stadium, and they were the home team. Now, the fact that the Jets came along, as you mentioned, they were an AFL team, so they were not. I think history would have treated them a little differently if they were an NFL team at that point. But they were originally the New York Titans, and then becoming the New York Jets. And to a man, you're correct. The Mets were always the primary tenants in that building, and the Jets were. You said that you use the term second-class citizens, and I think that's kind of the way it happened. And I don't think when the Jets left Shea, in the early '80s, that was a big surprise, or that anybody really noticed, because other than the fact that the Jets and the Mets played there all those years, it was really always considered the Mets ballpark.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the reason why I would want to maybe start there is only because before we start layering in other teams that were temporary inhabitants of Shea during this year, is to maybe to sort of dig in a little bit. It's my understanding. I learn every time I have a conversation on this show, which is I guess partially why I do it. Is the extent to which the Jets had to change and move their schedule around to accommodate somewhat open-ended. Now, in the case of the Mets schedule, most of which, tended to end on time, i.e. no playoffs. But in a couple of years, of course, when the Mets got hot, it did make a difference because it meant that the Jets contractually could not be playing during the time that the Mets were still, quote unquote, in season, right? So ironically, you want to be rooting for your co-tenant, right, as a sort of a civic, a booster and cheerleader for one's own, co-occupants. But in many respects, I could see the Jets actually wishing the worst on the Mets, right, so that they get their damn season going.
Absolutely, you're correct.
Yeah, it feels to me that tension is kind of an interesting starting point to this conversation because you already had two teams that ostensibly, were kind of had a bit of friction over the years and for many years as their seasons overlapped, sometimes gently and sometimes actually quite substantially.
Yeah, I think that, I'm not sure how much, and people who have studied the Jets in more depth during their AFL years might have a better answer for this, but I don't know that the friction was, as outwardly evident as it might be in today's culture. I mean, the Jets, didn't, they were playing in the AFL, and that was considered, a secondary league. So, they could not play any home games until the Mets were done with their season. As you mentioned, and that never changed really. I mean, and it went right up until 1975 that, when both football teams were playing there, and I don't want to jump ahead, but neither of them could play until the Mets and Yankees were done. So it really did put a crimp into the Jets scheduling and into the NFL scheduling, or originally the AFL, and then of course the NFL scheduling. But yeah, there was always that, the Mets had, if you want to call it, a nicer locker room. I don't think any of the clubhouses at Shea Stadium were certainly not state of the art, but the Jets were relegated to their own, locker room. They didn't get, the Mets facility. So there were always 1 and, 1A, if that, at Shea.
Well, all right. So with that as sort of a little bit of a background, let's maybe get more into the 1975. But actually, really, I think the story even starts a year before, right? Because you now have – so let's talk about 1974 because that's literally the first year where the Yankees were in need of a playing facility. Maybe you want to get into some of the reasons as to why, and the prelude that set in the tone for the next year in '75 when it got really crazy, huh?
Sure, and I'll keep people in suspense, but the seeds were originally planted actually in 1972 when the Giants announced that they were going to be building a facility in New Jersey. But we'll put that on hold for a second, because you're right, the Yankees had announced that they wanted to do this major renovation to Yankee Stadium, and it really was not a refurbishing. If you look at really look into what they did at Yankee Stadium during the 74 and 75 seasons, other than the actual outside facade, they ripped the entire stadium apart and built, in essence, a new stadium within. So there was no way that the Yankees were going to be able to play there for at least 2 seasons. And the Mets did not want the Yankees there. There was no question about that. But the city of New York owned the stadium, and that wasn't really an option for the Mets. They couldn't say no. So it was a fait accompli that the Yankees would be there for the 74 and 75 season. The Mets, were coming off in 1974. They were just a year removed from being National League champions and playing in the World Series and losing in the World Series in 7 games. So it was not like the Mets were irrelevant at the time. Far from it. They were, like I said, just 1 year removed from the World Series. The Yankees hadn't been there in a while. They were building a team, and by 75 they would get better. But in 74, the Yankees and Mets and Jets all shared what was a very crowded Shea Stadium.
How did the scheduling between these two teams in 74 actually work, right? I'm guessing the Mets, because it's their home stadium, kind of got scheduled first, but I'm just curious as to how Major League Baseball and Shea dealt with scheduling 2 teams. I think probably, I guess in the modern era, probably was kind of the first time it's ever happened.
Yeah, and it was an everyday affair, right? So there was very few days off, and keeping in mind that we didn't have to worry about football yet, because as we said earlier, the Jets were not going to be allowed to play there until baseball season was over. And to your point, neither the Mets or the Yankees at that point were really playoff teams, so the season was going to be over. In late September. The baseball season didn't seem to drip over as late as it does now. So by October, football could start. But Major League Baseball had to go and be very diligent. And I don't know that they gave the Mets priority necessarily. I did do a lot of research into the scheduling of the games. And, one of the things, one of the key people in this book is the head groundskeeper for the Mets and at Shea Stadium, who was a gentleman by the name of Pete Flynn, who passed away a couple of years ago. The field never got a day off. And at that point, and I guess I'm sure we'll talk about the field conditions and the playing conditions. Shea Stadium did not have an underground sprinkler system. The infield was hard like a rock. The outfield didn't drain. By the time football season rolled around, the field at Shea Stadium was in really bad shape because of that schedule of literally playing every single day.
So, in essence, there was pretty much baseball just about every day during the spring and summer, right?
There was, and there were even other things going on, because you have to remember that Yankee Stadium, because it was Yankee Stadium, hosted a lot of other things, such as the New York City high school baseball championships, such as Grambling College football played an exhibition game there, or one of their games there every year. So when the Yankees moved over to Shea for those 2 years, everything that Yankee Stadium hosted moved along to Shea Stadium those 2 years. So, my book obviously deals specifically about 1975, so I can speak to some of those specific instances, but both in 74 and 75, it was more, believe it or not, than just Yankees and Mets and, the everyday scheduling. It was all the other things that came along with it.
So you're mentioning groundskeepers and stuff. So when the Yankees were playing and when the Mets were playing, did the Yankees essentially, and I'm sure this bleeds into 75 as well, but did the Yankees have to kind of defer to the groundskeepers and the and the folks that managed Shea Stadium, or were they allowed to import their own folks or maybe inject a bit of their own, Yankees-ness into the proceedings?
So from everything I could understand, there were 2 separate grounds crews. and the Yankees did have a head groundskeeper. But Pete Flynn, and he was named head groundskeeper in '75. He had been with the Mets since '62 in the Polo Grounds when he came over as a young, somebody who knew about, tending a garden and stuff, and got a job as a groundskeeper in the Polo Grounds. So by '75, he was the head groundskeeper. '74 was, he was still on the crew. And the Yankees did have their own staff and their own grounds crew that came over from Yankee Stadium, but I think they always sort of deferred to the Mets staff, being that was their building.
And so that's interesting. And so, all right, so that's the baseball thing. So that's kind of, the scene set as 74 as a prelude to 75. But let's back up a little bit then and get into sort of the football part of the equation, because you're mentioning back a few years earlier, sort of this announcement that the New York Football Giants were looking to find and or build their own new stadium on their own. So maybe a little bit of background on their somewhat peripatetic journey for the years prior to 1975 in the lead up to what eventually became Giant Stadium.
Sure. So you mentioned about scheduling, and the Yankees, the Giants always felt that they were being treated as second-class citizens to the Yankees. So the Giants wanted no part of staying at Yankee Stadium unless they were going to be given, quote unquote, equal billing. And that was really never going to happen. I mean, it was Yankee Stadium after all. So in 1972, Wellington Mara, the owner of the Giants, announced that he was going to move his team to New Jersey to this, great big facility, which was going to be set in East Rutherford, New Jersey, on what ended up being called the Meadowlands. But that it would take, several years to build, and because it was going to be this big structure, and they would have to build it on top of a swamp, and it was going to take a lot of time, so that they would play out their time at Yankee Stadium. And the mayor of New York City at the time was Mayor Wagner, and he wanted no part of it. He was basically furious that the New York Football Giants were leaving New York and New York City, and he basically said, "See ya, get out," and more or less evicted the Giants from Yankee Stadium. So they had no place to play, and ended up in 1973 and 1974 playing up at the Yale Bowl in Connecticut in a college football facility. Which seems unbelievable today. Today to think the New York Giants are playing at the Yale Bowl, although today's New York Giants probably wouldn't sell out the Yale Bowl. But that notwithstanding, they had a very bad time up in Connecticut. They were away from their families. They had no fans up there. They won, I think, 2 or 3 games the entire 3-year period, and really needed to have another option. And then I don't want to jump ahead, but I guess we're at the point now where there was a new mayor in New York City. The mayor had become Abe Beame, who was friends with Wellington Mara, and he said, "Listen, there's one more year before you're going to go to New Jersey. Why don't you come back and play a season at Shea Stadium?" And in the past, Mara had scoffed at the idea of playing at Shea, didn't want any part of it, but it was kind of an olive branch by Mayor Beame, and Mara took it. And alas, 4 teams at Shea Stadium.
So the Mets had to be apoplectic at all this, right? Because they didn't own the stadium, right? This is really that of the New York City government, right? That pretty much. So it seems like, in many respects, their hands were tied. Not only with the Yankees situation for 2 years, but then adding adding another football team on top of already probably an overlap. Situation between their co-inhabitants, the Jets. I mean, is the Mets management like just nuts over all this stuff, or are they kind of like, well, yeah, I can't imagine they would just take this sort of sitting down.
They were nuts over all of it. They were absolutely furious. They wanted no part of it. They didn't want the Yankees there. And I'm sure, quite frankly, if they had their way, they didn't even want the Jets there. When the Giants became a legitimate option and it was going to go from 2 to 3 to now 4 teams at their stadium. And remember, as we said way back, they always considered this their stadium. It wasn't just that it was viewed as their stadium. They considered it their stadium. This was a baseball stadium that was built basically to retrofit to football. It was one of the first stadiums to have low-level seats that were on tracks that could kind of curve in to change the seating configuration for football. But this was a baseball stadium, and it was built as a giant horseshoe. It was not built for football. So the Mets didn't want anybody else as tenants, and that's how they kind of viewed it. They kind of thought of everybody else as these tenants that were squatting in their stadium. And by 75, I think they threw their hands up. They knew they had no control over it. They knew that after 75, the Giants and the Yankees were leaving, and so they had to get through the one season. And I'm not going to say they grin and bared it. They bared it.
Did they give it any kind of a compensation or recompense or some other concessions, either by the city or by any of the leagues, for triple hosting, if you will, these other teams?
Yeah, I didn't find any of that, and I think part of it is the Mets really had no say. You mentioned it, a few minutes ago. The Mets had no say in any of it. Didn't own the stadium. They didn't own the land that the stadium was on. And in 1975, sports was very different. I mean, the teams that are building these multi-billion-dollar stadiums and that own their own stadiums these days, that didn't exist in 1975. This was owned by New York City, and New York City in 1975 wasn't even close to the kind of place New York City is today. It was a very downtrodden, dilapidated city, and which was in huge financial issues. So there was no one was going to build a new stadium for one of these teams. The Yankee Stadium was going to be finished after the 75 season, as I said. They were hoping and really wishing and keeping fingers crossed that the Meadowlands was going to be ready for the 76 football season, which it was. And going back to normal, I mean, after having 4 teams, I think the Mets were fine with having just them and the Jets because that felt like they were all alone again.
If I remember correctly, and these are hazy childhood memories, right? But if the Shea Stadium's setup was, how can I best put it, not sort of necessarily the easiest to transform from one sport to another, right? Because there was the way it was sort of constructed, and you're mentioning or hinting at some tracks, I guess, for stands that sort of would come in and out depending on whether it was a baseball or football configuration. How difficult or straightforward was the transformation process for changing from one sport to another? Not that was common, right, because of the overlap situation, but I got to think it had to enter into some kind of thinking in terms of like how quickly or not events could be turned around in time for either another tenant or, hell, I would imagine there's some other things beyond these 4 teams, like a concert or two once in a while.
Yes, absolutely. And at 75, there wasn't as much extra things on the agenda other than those Yankee things I had mentioned. I mean, in subsequent years, there was everything at Shea Stadium. I mean, the Pope was there in the late 70s. They had wrestling there. They had, obviously, concerts there. They even had, and this is one of my favorites that I mentioned in the book, they even had the Ice Capades there once. So I'm not even sure how that worked, but they did have the Ice Capades outside of Shea Stadium. And to your point, they did not have to transform it back and forth that often because once it was football for the most part. They did have tracks that the field level seats at Shea Stadium did kind of curve out to line what would be the sidelines of a football field, but it was still not a good place to watch a football game because if you know what Shea Stadium looks like, or if you could picture it in your mind, it was a giant horseshoe with an open, from the foul line to the foul line on a baseball field, it was open in the outfield, other than a scoreboard and some bleachers out there. So because of that, the wind was just brutal for football in the colder months. As the winter months of Shea Stadium, with the wind coming off the water, Shea Stadium was built right on the edge of Flushing Bay. And the field conditions were just absolutely horrid for football. There was no grass left for the most part in 75 by the time the Jets and Giants kicked off the season. And it was hard like a rock, and it was dusty, and if it rained, it was swampy. And I'm not sure transforming the stadium back and forth was even as much of an issue as the fact that it just wasn't a great place to watch a football game.
All right. Calm down. We'll be back to our conversation in just a minute. But I do want to pay some bills around here, And look, we're guilty as anyone, probably more so than anybody, of living in the past, right? The show is about nostalgia and looking back and trying to remember and unearth things about teams and leagues that have come and gone, shall we say. And, it's good. It's good to learn from history and remember some of those things. But look, you can't live in the past, right? You got to keep moving forward. Life goes on. And look, at all the sports and teams and leagues that we follow, there's just so much excitement out there. We got a fantasy team or 2 or 10. You got sports talk out there. We were talking about modern day sports as it got built up on the shoulders of history in this little podcast. And my guess is that more than a fair share of you listeners out there want to find a decent place to place a little wager or two once in a while, especially when you have an inkling, you got a special feeling, you think you know what's going to happen. Why not make some bucks on that little hunch? Well, we're here to help you, right? MyBookie is the place to go. It's our brand new sponsor, and we appreciate their patronage of our little show. MyBookie.ag. That's probably the best place that I know of to get going and do some online wagering. And look, you've been living under a rock. You recognize that the courts have changed over the last couple of months, and the mores around gambling seems to be loosening when it comes to sports gambling. And MyBookie is the place to go, as far as I'm concerned. MyBookie.ag to get set up and get some good wagers. And they're good at payouts. They're good at all of that service that you expect. I highly recommend them. I've heard nothing but good things about them. You'll see all the online reviews are top notch as well. And look, we also have you covered too. When you give them a try, use the promo code SEATS, and they're going to match your initial deposit dollar for dollar all the way up to $1,000. So if you're looking for some extra scratch to put against some of your hunches and you want to get some online sports bets out there, MyBookie, it's the place to go. I highly recommend it. And it's mybookie.ag. Make sure you use the promo code, of course, SEATS. SEATS is the promo code, and you're going to get that dollar for dollar match of your initial deposit all the way up to $1,000. And why not use that extra coinage, shall we say, to hopefully win a couple of good solid bets on your first go around with MyBookie, mybookie.ag. We thank them for their sponsorship of our show. And now back to our conversation. Were there any times during, say, the baseball season, obviously football a little bit more regularly scheduled on a weekly basis, was there any time during the playing of the 74 season for that matter too? I'm wondering what conflicts there might have been, right? So rainouts and making up games and the doubleheader kind of thing. And I'm just wondering if there were ever any times during those two seasons that the Yankees and the Mets had to step on each other's toes and adjust their schedule. I got to imagine there was a bit of creativity that had to occur during those two seasons.
Yeah, absolutely. And I went into when I went into the research process for this book very early on, I was absolutely fully expecting to hear from former players that it was a pain in the neck and it was a real, pain to have the Mets there or the Yankees there or vice versa. Nobody really had those stories. I spoke to Ed Kranepool, who was, on the Mets since the 62 season. So by the time 75 rolled around, he was a veteran. And he said, they hardly passed in the night. The schedules were made and, they followed the schedules. And there were days that they would practice at the facility the same day because, unlike football, baseball didn't have and still really doesn't have separate, training facilities other than spring training. But, during the season, they all just practice and take BP and fielding practice at the stadium. And there were days where the Yankees would come in if they were off that day and have batting practice the day before a Mets home game that night. So there would be, double things scheduled, double dipping, if you will. It would have, some of the players joked that they were expecting to see Joe Namath come in and throw some balls, later in the afternoon as well, just to get warmed up as well. But, as I said, I think the Jets kind of kept their difference and their distance, and the Jets did have a training facility that they could play at. So, I don't think that I know there was never a time where the Yankees and Mets played a regular season game in 74 or 75 on the same day in the same stadium. That didn't happen. That would have been kind of a cool postscript if the Mets had a day game and the Yankees had a night game. That did not happen. But they did practice. There would be times where the Yankees or Mets would practice on the field, and then the other team would play that night.
Yeah, ironically, that did happen right in sometime in the 90s, right? Wasn't there a case where I guess the Yankees, I think it was 1998, right, where the Yankees they had to play a game at Shea because there was I guess a collapsed beam or something from the Yankee Stadium that day, and I think the Mets had a game in the evening, so I think that was actually the only time that ever happened. Ironically, not during the two seasons where they were sharing the same facility.
Exactly. There's actually a funny story from that as well, because Darryl Strawberry, who was a longtime Met, was actually on the Yankees at that time, and in that game at Shea Stadium, he slammed a home run, and the Mets have this home run apple that always goes up every time they hit a home run, and someone hit the button to send the Mets home run apple up after Darryl Strawberry of the Yankees had hit the home run. So, and I believe it got about halfway up until someone realized that was probably a bad idea, and they hit the button and it went back down.
And for those of you scoring at home, that was on April 15th, 1998, that interesting asterisk in baseball history happened at Shea. Let me ask you this. Did you how did the fans, what was the reaction, I guess, of the press and the fans to this sort of factory, I guess, of 1995 at one place? I wonder if it was fun and interesting, or boring or monotonous, or a pain, a challenge. I'm just curious as to how, were people kind of grinning and bearing it, so to speak, like this is just a temporary thing and let's just have fun with it? What was the sort of reaction to all Shea all the time that year?
Well, yeah, and the attendance for both teams was very low. Because the teams were not good, they did not draw well. But what the interesting thing about fans is, along the way of writing this book, and as I'm sure you're like this too when you're doing research for a podcast or for anything you're doing. You talk to people and you tell them what you're doing and you get feedback, and people would tell me, it's funny you talk about Shea Stadium, and I say, because I remember going to a Yankee game at Shea Stadium, and I could never reconcile that. So the fans that had been there, specifically Yankee fans for Yankee games that had been there in 75, almost had the fact that it had happened erased from their memory, other than they remember seeing the Yankees in a strange environment. I don't think, the fans, much like the players, never kind of intersected. The fans certainly didn't. One of the people I got to interview for the book is Howie Rose, who is the Mets radio announcer, and really one of the foremost authorities, if not the foremost authority, of Mets history. And he said he had a really good line. He said he was very unhappy as a young boy, or older, I think he was in his 20s, watching the Yankees play at Shea Stadium. He said it was kind of like eating a pork chop at a bar mitzvah.
Howie Rose, that's funny. Well, so it also, do I have this correct as well, that in 74, maybe even in 75, there was even an attempt, or at least the question or the inquiry by the fledgling New York Stars of the World Football League to play at Shea Stadium as well. Did that come up in any of your research?
That actually did not come up, but that would not surprise me, because you have to remember there was no other place to play in this area. Right. There really wasn't. There was no, there's no big time college football team that would have been able to share a stadium with them. Shea Stadium was it. It was really at that point the only stadium in the New York City metropolitan area that would, unless you went as far as, New Haven, Connecticut, where Yale was. But the NFL team failed there. I don't think that the Stars would have done well there. And so there weren't a lot of options. That did not happen to come up in my research or in my book, but that does not surprise me at all.
Yeah, and having grown up as a Cosmos fan too, they're also played into that too. That's where Randall's Island, Downing Stadium, and Randall's Island, the less than I would even say high school quality stadium. Interestingly located, under the Triborough Bridge there. It looks good on the map,
absolutely.
but it's a pain in the butt to get to. And once you get there, you kind of wished you weren't there. But, when Pele came in 75, right, that was, I'm pretty sure, and I think I've asked a few of our Cosmos related guests over the many months that I'm sure that inquiries were made about Shea's availability in 74 and 75 when they were both at Downing Stadium. I'm sure that's exactly what happened to the Stars as well. But again, you bring up a very interesting point. I mean, this is like the middle of the 1970s, arguably, some level of modernity and culture in New York City, being some of the, the biggest city in the country and obviously at a world stage. And here you are, right? It only has really one major facility operational, right? One's down for the count for 2 years. There is no Giant Stadium. There is no, Barclays Center. There is no, there's no extra capacity anywhere. And it's just hard to believe that you wonder what would have happened if something had happened to Shea during that season.
Absolutely. And, it's a little side note about Downing Stadium on Randall's Island. It's funny. I was speaking to a gentleman by the name of Roby Young, who played for the Cosmos, I believe, right after Pele, either right before or right after Pele. And he said that the field conditions at Downing Stadium were so bad that they literally spray painted the field green so that it looked like a soccer field because there was no grass there at all in a lot of spots. And he said that's what they were dealing with. He said it was bumpy and rocky, and it was a terrible place to play. And you're thinking that here comes Pele, the greatest player to ever live, playing in these field conditions.
Yeah, there's a famous story. His inaugural game in the summer of '75, which was a hastily arranged exhibition. He was playing, and then after the first half, he came into the locker room and he essentially made motions that he wanted to quit the team because his legs had been all green, blotchy, and he thought he had gotten some kind of fungus, and they had to tell him that it was green paint. And
that's right.
I think he laughed it off, but not a happy situation. But it does speak to, and you wonder, right? The WFL, right, had a lot of other issues and problems, but you wonder, if the Stars, who had to relocate to Charlotte midway in the season, that's how comical that league was. You wonder if they had some stability with a major league facility in a Shea or Yankee Stadium for that matter, they could have even made it, but not to be the case, right? I guess the one thing that's interesting to me about the 1975 adventure where you had all four of these teams playing at Shea, and again, this is based on my knowledge, and you probably have a deeper understanding of the nuances here. It does not seem to me that any of these four franchises, Yankees, Mets, Jets, or Giants, had anything resembling a memorable season. As a matter of fact, in some cases, some worth forgetting.
Absolutely. They were all, for lack of a better word, they were all terrible. The Mets were only 2 years removed from a World Series berth and were nothing resembling a championship team. They had Tom Seaver, who had a great year that year and won a Cy Young Award. They had a couple of good hitters, Rusty Staub, who we lost this past year, but was the first Met to ever, drive in 100 runs in a season. He did it that year. But the Mets were, in the early stages of what was going to be a terrible, terrible downward spiral through the mid and late 1970s into the early 1980s. The Yankees were not good either. They had a manager, Bill Verdon, who is the answer to a trivia question. He's the only manager in Yankees history to have never won a game at Yankee Stadium because he managed for 1974 and half of 1975 until he was fired midway through the season and replaced by Billy Martin in Martin's first tenure with the Yankees. However, the Yankees had signed Catfish Hunter before that season, so they were going to be on the upswing. By 76, they were American League champions, and by 77, 78, they were world champions. So they christened their new stadium quite well. But in 75, they were not good at all. And, they had some young players like Elliot Maddox, who was a young phenom. They had just traded Bobby Mercer because Bobby Mercer couldn't hit home runs in 1974 at Shea Stadium because the right field at Shea Stadium was so much further than the right field porch. I think he had 2 home runs all in all of the home games in '74. So they traded him and got Bobby Bonds, and things were bad for the Yankees. And the Giants and the Jets, if it's possible, were worse than the Yankees and the Mets. The Jets and the Giants were just, Namath was a shell of what Namath once was, although he didn't have a terrible season in '75. He played for the entire season, which was un-Namath-like for many of his years during his career. And that, as I mentioned about the Giants, they were just they won 5 games during the season and had one eye at Shea Stadium and the other eye across the river at what would end up being Giant Stadium the following year. So no, as I mentioned in the very first paragraph of the book, that 1975 certainly was not one of the most successful seasons for New York sports, but it was certainly one of the oddest.
I'm curious on the baseball side. Did the we talked about sort of the groundskeeping thing, but did the Yankees? How much? You mentioned or hinted at maybe some of the players, but what do they have to do, the Yankees, in terms of adjustments, right? Because obviously the dimensions are different, and their staffing is built for at least a half a season that's in a Yankee Stadium that's a bit more cavernous and a little bit more maybe intimidating them in the sort of the more cookie cutter sort of version of Shea. Were there adjustments made that you could discern that the Yankees specifically made to accommodate or for the differences in a Shea Stadium versus a Yankee Stadium?
Well, the one big one, which I just mentioned, was trading, the beloved Bobby Mercer, because Mercer just was very frustrated. He couldn't hit home runs. They brought in a guy like Bobby Bonds, who had speed to patrol, a vast outfield. Shea Stadium's outfield was huge. They had a speedy right fielder by the name of Elliot Maddox. He was this young phenom, and unfortunately for Elliot Maddox, because the field did not drain well at Shea Stadium, he was playing in a swampy right field, tore up his knee, and was never the same. In fact, years and years later, when he actually ironically ended up playing for the Mets in the early 80s, he walked out to right field and he told a reporter he was going out there to see if he could find his knee. So, he actually sued the city, he sued Billy Martin, he sued the Yankees, he sued the Mets. Elliot Maddox had a bad situation. So any adjustments that the Yankees made for Shea Stadium certainly did not work out well for Elliot Maddox. Other than that, I think that, there was not much that could be done. They did bring in, as I mentioned, Jim Catfish Hunter was a premier pitcher in that day, and Shea Stadium was a good pitcher's park. It's one of the reasons that guys like in the 60s and 70s, guys like Tom Seaver and Jerry Koosman and John Matlack had such great success, because often if the balls went up, between left center and right center at Shea Stadium, they weren't going out of the park. And I think that hurt the Yankees in '74, and I think they did make some adjustments in '75 to try to alleviate that. But again, they didn't want to make too many, roster moves that they couldn't undo, because in '76 they were going back to that, short right field porch.
Yeah. Also on the football side, right? It also seems to me too that adjustments had to be made. I'm not sure it's as dramatic or as pronounced, say, on the baseball side, because there are nuances to baseball. Every park is different, right? Where football is, on a standard grid, and the grid is a grid, right? Maybe there are adjustments from, the circular winds of Shea versus, say, what a Yale Bowl did or didn't have. But it did seem to me that each team had to kind of not only account for sort of that overlap of the baseball season those first couple of weeks, but it seemed to me they had to kind of jam in a lot of home games near sort of the tail end of the schedule. And if I'm not mistaken, it looks like that the Giants and the Jets had to play back-to-back games on a couple of weekends, which, by the way, could not have been great for the turf. But, I'm sure do I have this right? The Giants had to play 2 of their weekend games near the end of the season on a Saturday, while the Jets had to play that Sunday. And I think the Giants, because of that, lost out on being televised and some of the other goodies that come along with a regular scheduled game.
Yes. First of all, you're absolutely right that there were Saturday games, which was unusual in the first place. And, you mentioned, adjustments that had to be made. And you're right, football is a much more, grid-like sport. And you kind of, you run from goal line to goal line. But that some of the challenges that the football players had. One of the gentlemen I got to speak to was Richard Castor, who was an all-pro tight end for the Jets that year. And, he said, Namath would be under center and, kicking his legs up, and literally giant chunks of whatever was left in the turf would come up. And, that was actually part of the game plan. It's not game plan so much as it was part of what they had to deal with was turf coming up, flying out, divots. The field was so bad. Now, again, I don't think it cost the Jets and Giants any games, because I don't think they were to win those games that they lost anyway. But the field was in such horrendous shape by football that, although I didn't speak to anybody who said this, straight out, I assume that, play calling had to be affected by the field, because the field was really not in bad shape. It was almost impassable shape. I don't think in today's game they would allow a field to go, an NFL team to play on the field that they ended up playing on, the second half of that football season.
All right. So in your investigation, as we sort of round third base here, any particular things of wackiness or oddities that sort of occurred? I last night, I think I stumbled onto one of them, which was this this New York Yankees 21-gun salute with the Army. Does that ring a bell?
Yes, indeed. So the Yankees were it was, I believe, they were celebrating the either the 100th anniversary of an anniversary of the Armed Forces, and they had a great idea. They were going to do a 21-gun salute towards center field, from center field towards the center field fence, and the force of the blast, even though they were blanks, was so powerful that it literally blew the center field fence down, completely down. And I spoke to Marty Appel, who, of course, has written so many great Yankee books, including, the Thurman Munson biography and Pinstripe Empire and so many others. And he said he just remembers having there was a young PR man by the name of Barry Landers who had come up with the idea, and he was standing on the field as it happened. And he remembered looking at, Marty Appel was the PR director. I guess Barry Landers was in charge of this event, and he just remembers seeing Barry's face as the center field fence was literally blown down.
So what happened? I mean, did they play the game, or did they have to delay the game, or did they postpone it?
They did hit it. They delayed it. They I guess they propped the fence up as best they could. They did not want to cancel the game, and by all accounts, they played the game. But it was a very embarrassing moment for the Yankees and also for everybody involved with Shea Stadium, because it wasn't that in 1975 Shea Stadium was only 11 years old, but it was already in pretty bad shape. Shea Stadium did not age well at all. It became an old stadium very quickly, which is ironic because it had a lot of modernity that other stadiums didn't have. It was the first stadium with an electronic scoreboard. It was the first stadium with a lot of these bells and whistles that other stadiums didn't have at the time. Of course, by today's standards, it's laughable. But Shea Stadium got old very fast. So this instance was certainly an embarrassment to the Yankees and to the Shea Stadium in general, the people who were there. And the Mets. One of the things that the Mets had was they had Old Timers Day with Casey Stengel and Joan Payson riding around on a little chariot, and it wasn't necessarily an embarrassing moment, but it was just a moment of you got to wonder what's going on here. It wasn't necessarily a major league product that they were putting on the field before or after games, but there was a lot of strange things that went on in 75, and the blowing down of the fence was probably one of the highlights or lowlights.
And I think for New York Giants fans, this is a little sort of mogul or stub, I guess, of history as well. Is this, long lost logo? I think it only happened for the 1 year. It's sort of this stylized NY, sort of like a modern sort of capital N, capital Y logo that I don't think they ever revisited or brought back. It was almost, I guess a one and done season kind of thing. It's been much maligned, but we'll have a picture of it. We'll put it up there on our website and stuff. But I guess it was originally designed to be somewhat neutral, knowing that they were already playing a bunch of games in Connecticut. They were now a season at Shea Stadium, which was not their home either, and then obviously going to wind up in the wilds of Nirvana in New Jersey. But it's interesting, this new sort of, and I actually think it's a pretty cool logo. And this sort of, it's like a kind of like it looks like kind of a neon NY sort of on the blue helmet. Really didn't make it past this season.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It almost had, and I don't know if this even makes sense, but it almost had a disco feel to it. You know, it had a like a retro before there was retro, and I'm not sure why they decided to change the logo that year. I think that part of it was they knew they were going to have to change the logo the following year because they were not going to be able to play in New Jersey and have an NY on their helmet. And, of course, they ended up switching to the helmets for so many years. It said Giants on either side. In the last several years, they've gone back to the NY, despite still playing in New Jersey, but no one seems to really care or notice that. I guess I assume the people in New Jersey do, but the people in New York were okay with it. But yeah, it was. And the thing that made it interesting is that when we were preparing to the layout of the book, I was involved with picking the photos for the book, and we had Mets and Yankees and Jets, and of course the Giants, and it was both good and bad because there were only so many photos to choose from because we needed to have photos with that specific NY logo, and that team, as I said, quarterbacked by Craig Morton, was not a team that a lot of photos survived from that year. So we did grab a couple of them and we made it work. But yeah, that's a little known fact, and it was one season, and it was a very strange NY.
All right, so maybe the last question is, what is your? I suspect that you become not only in the office but also just on the internet and elsewhere, sort of this de facto expert about 1975 and Shea Stadium and all the things that were part of that. I bet you even discover stuff that people sort of share with you. What of memorabilia? Was there anything that any of these teams did to outwardly commemorate, aside from sort of the annual yearbook and that kind of stuff? Obviously, if you're a Giants fan, that New York logo, that 1 year logo, is obviously a remembrance of that, and perhaps hard to find kind of thing. I'm just wondering if the Yankees, had any sort of commemoration of things, or are there any special souvenirs or memorabilia maybe out there that either people relish and cherish, or maybe wonder if there may be pieces of that are still out there, in your search and your travels?
It's a great question. It really is. And I think that what's interesting is that both teams, it seems, have tried to pretend that 1974 and 1975 never happened, because when Shea Stadium was closing, they listed all of the things that, they had all these photo montages and video montages of all these great things that happened at Shea Stadium over the years, and there was really no mention of the Yankees playing there at all. So the Mets certainly have kind of buried it deep in whatever historical archives they have. Not a lot of memorabilia out there. The couple of things that I thought were kind of cool, in research along the way, and one of which I have a photo of in the book, is they did have a big billboard in Flushing, Queens, which had a Yankee logo, and it said, hey, Yankee fans, welcome to Queens. So that billboard, I'm sure, was thrown away somewhere or destroyed soon after the 75 season. That would be a very cool item to have. There's not a lot of things left that really could have, survived, because after this, there really was nothing that made the Yankees feel like it was their stadium. They didn't really. The one thing the Mets had was in center field, which was, I guess, before its time. They used to be able to show slides of players' faces above the big giant scoreboard. In later years, it became a clock, and it didn't do it anymore. I guess once things like the video boards came into play. So they did take the Mets logo off of that and put a Yankee logo up on the days that the Yankees were playing. But yeah, not a lot has survived, and it's a shame because although it certainly wasn't a golden age for either team or for the stadium itself, it would have been nice to have some things the things that remain and you can still get on eBay are ticket stubs. I actually one of the things I did was when I was writing the book, I actually went on eBay and bought a couple of ticket stubs just so I had them. It said Yankees versus Indians at Shea Stadium on a Tuesday night in April or whatever it was. Because I think that is something that's kind of cool. And so those things remain. The scorebooks are still around, a couple of them at least. And, we're talking about 1975 being 43 years ago at this point. So less and less survives. But there are a few things out there. And it's if people have interest in it, they can certainly get their hands on it. And hopefully I've told enough decent stories in this book to bring back some of the memories.
No, it's interesting, and again, these are so we do like to tackle places and palaces that you used to host not only teams and leagues no longer with us, but teams that are still with us, and and Shea obviously has a lot of history for lots of different reasons on the field, but this is an interesting little sidebar to I would it's hard. I'll stop short of calling Shea a venerable stadium. It was utilitarian, sure. It was convenient to a certain extent, sure. It was modern for its time, yes. It was multi-purpose for sure. Architecturally, it had a couple of interesting new innovations, right, at the time. But I don't know many people that sort of look back. I guess fondness is probably not the first word that comes in. It might make the top 5 in people's memories, right? Because perhaps they saw the Beatles, in their first concert, or they, went to their first Met or Jet game, or, they remember, winning they remember the Super Bowl season, or they remember, the 2 world championships of the Mets, where the playoff runs that just came short. But I don't know. I don't know how many people sort of lovingly remember it. As a structure, but the memories within, though, certainly a different story.
Absolutely, and I think Mets fans of a certain age, and you remember, as time goes on, less and less people will have remembered being at Shea Stadium, depending on your age. But there is this feeling of nostalgia still for Shea Stadium. I mean, one of the things they did when they built Citi Field was they actually left home plate, the pitcher's mound, and all 4 bases, and not the actual bases, but they've marked those things off, and they remain in the parking lot at Citi Field. So I actually, every time I go to a Met game, if not every time, but almost every time, I always swing by Shea and remember, and I'm always amazed at how close it was to Citi Field, because Citi Field actually sprouted up over the last couple of years of Shea Stadium, and it's really remarkable when you realize it's out of context because there's no stadium around it, but how close home plate was to where Citi Field is now. It doesn't seem like it's that far, but yeah, I think people look back on it. I think you're right. I think fond is maybe a strong word, and I don't know that fond is a strong word in general, but I think that the feeling of Met fans towards the end of Shea's days were, it's a dump, but it's our dump. And I think, because of, and you mentioned this, because of some of the things that happened in the mid-'80s, and the team was so good, and, of course, the championship in '86, and, the thing is, for Met fans, there hasn't been another championship. So, the Mets have never won any place other than Shea Stadium. Certainly, they made it to the World Series in 2015 and lost to Kansas City. And I think that season kind of made Citi Field feel more like a true Met stadium. But the fact is that the Mets have never won a championship anywhere but Shea Stadium. And until they do, Shea Stadium will always have this place. And I think even when they do, Shea Stadium will always have this place. It wasn't a great place to go watch a game. There wasn't a lot of options to eat at Shea Stadium, and God forbid you had to go to the bathroom. But the fact was that was the stadium that many people grew up in, and that's the stadium that many people had seen the first in baseball games in when they were younger. And remember, by 1976, Yankee Stadium was in essence a brand new stadium. So Shea Stadium was the senior stadium in the city, and not necessarily for all good reasons, but that was just a fact. It was. So, It's gone. It is remembered today, and I think holds certainly a place in New York baseball and football history.
All right, so give us some promotional goodness. Tell us about the book, where you can find it. Oh, you know what? Before we even do that, one sort of last question. What if anybody? I mean, this book recently came out. Does anybody in any of the 4 franchises? Has there been any? Warm memories and come on our podcast or talk about this with us, or has it been, to your point earlier, kind of something we'd rather forget? Thanks for calling. From
the franchises themselves.
Yeah.
So I did go on when the book first came out. I was on the Mets have they've just recently changed radio networks, but on the radio network they were on when the book came out. They did the people who do it wasn't quite the official pregame show, but it was a show that aired on the Mets network. They did have me come on and talk about it. But no, I don't think that the Jets and the Giants have totally washed their hands of anything that's ever happened at Shea Stadium, as far as I know. And the Mets and Yankees have not reached out. I have had very kind things from some of the people I spoke to who were around at that time. In other words, Marty Appel, who I interviewed for the book, who was the PR director in 1975, had very, very nice things to say about the book and was really thought I did a good, it said to me that I did a really good job capturing that time period. So to me, that meant a lot because somebody like him who, was from the, quote unquote alien team that was playing at Shea. He was the PR director. He's a renowned award-winning author himself. So that meant a lot to me to have somebody like Marty Appel speak so highly of my book. And I think the franchises have kind of forgotten. There's not too many places. If you walk through the Mets and Yankees Hall of Fame, you're not going to see, or the Jets and Giants for that matter, you're not going to see a lot of references to 1975, other than the fact that, Seaver won the Cy Young, Rusty Staub drove in 100 runs, Catfish Hunter, debuted for the Yankees. But, for the most part, the franchises keep their compliments to themselves.
Well, I think it's great. Like, I think this is really interesting stuff. And like you say, as people get older and they sort of forget all these little things, but, these are not only trivia questions, but this is part of their histories, right? And, some of it, frankly, speaks to the lack of stadia in the New York City metropolitan area at the time, and arguably even today, right? The Jets still, ironically, now are subtenants in the new MetLife Stadium, right? And were in Giant Stadium for some time as well. And the beginnings of that sort of shared relationship, either by convenience or otherwise, and the Jets, I'm sure the long-suffering Jets fans, would not like to be reminded of how all that kind of got started. And kind of lust for, there was a time, 10, 15 years ago where there was actually an opportunity for a new stadium and sort of how that played out. But, the Jets have always been sort of this number 2 team in the same building wherever the Giants are, really since this time. So it's fascinating. So give us a little bit stuff about the book. Are you going to be promoting it at all? Where people can find it and all that kind of stuff, how they can get in touch with you. Can they follow you on social media? Give us all that.
Yeah, absolutely. I promote it as much as I can, whenever I can, when anybody asks. I've actually had another book come out since this book came out, so I promote that as well. It's called Miracle Moments in New York Mets History. All of my books, and I have 4 of them, are available on Amazon and BarnesandNoble.com and all those easy places to get books. They make good Christmas and any kind of holiday gifts and Hanukkah gifts and whatever, and birthday gifts. If you have a Met fan, now the thing about this book that's kind of cool is that although none of the 4 teams really were great that year, the story is about all of them, the franchises, but it's also about New York City during 1975 and what was going on in the city and politics and pop culture. So, I don't think of it necessarily as a Mets book. So any of the 4, no matter who somebody roots for, or whether you're not even a fan of the teams, it's kind of an interesting little oddity and footnote in New York sports history. So yeah, it's available on all the websites, and I do have a website as well called TopelMetsBook.com.
Well, now you cannot say that we do not go deep, way deep into the nooks and crannies of forgotten sports history on this show. And if you're not taking advantage of this and using this to impress your friends at various social functions, well, shame on you. I mean, we bend over backwards each and every week to give you the arsenal that you need to look and feel intelligent about all things sports, and especially those that are of the forgotten variety for whatever reasons. And this week, hopefully no exception, and we appreciate you listening. And I learned stuff. I grew up in the area, in the New York City metropolitan area. I didn't know half of this stuff, and I'm ever fascinated by all of it. And 1975 in New York City, interesting and memorable for a number of reasons. And if you're a sports fan, well, there you go. Shea Stadium for various reasons, and not necessarily the quality of the teams on the field, for sure. You can find this fun book. It is a quick and an enjoyable read. It's called When Shea Was Home, the story of the 1975 Mets, Yankees, Giants, and Jets. Brent Topel is the author. It is published by Sports Publishing. You can find a link to it, as well as all kinds of interesting stuff related to this episode number 87, I believe it is, on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Make sure you go there early and often. You want an old episode from the show, by all means, you'll find them there. You want to find an easy link to order the book, this one in particular, or any of the others, or any of the other media or items that we discuss or talk about. You will find that as well on our site. And it's also the place to find all of our social media feeds. If you want to follow us on Twitter, we're at Good Seats Still. You'll find us on Instagram, of course, at Good Seats Still Available. You will find us on Facebook. There's a page devoted to us there. There's a newsletter, which we send out each and every weekend, giving our inside listeners, if you will, a taste of what's to come in the following week. So you get a little head start on your weekly listening and podcast downloading. Go on our website for that too, and just bookmark it, for God's sakes, and just keep visiting there early and often. Always updating with new stuff, and hopefully in the new year 2019, we'll be putting some more stuff up there, like more promotional items and the like. Let's see. We also want to say thank you, of course, to our friend Jerry Payne, the good doctor at Podfly Productions, podfly.net. He helps us produce and get all our fun and exciting pieces together to make somewhat of a coherent interview every week. We appreciate his help, of course, without which we couldn't do this show. And of course, we can't do the show without you. Thank you so much for listening. We appreciate it to no end. And we interrupt this ending of this show for this important news bulletin.
There was something of a doubleheader at New York City's Shea Stadium last night. Before the Yankees and the California Angels took the field, an artillery detachment from Brooklyn's Fort Hamilton observed the U.S. Army's 200th anniversary with a 21-gun salute. The cannons were loaded with blanks, of course, but close enough to the outfield fence to blast a hole at one point and start a fire at another. Repairs were made in time for the ball game. Final scores: Yankees 6, Angels 4, Army 21, fence nothing. And that's the way it is. Wednesday, June 11th, 1975. This is Walter Cronkite, CBS News. Good night.